Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. 7 after 8 o'clock. And our first guest is Zeenat Adam from the Afro-Middle East Centre. Assalamu alaikum, Zeenat. Long time no speak. Lovely to have you on the show this morning.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me.
Zeenat, are you there? I can't hear you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Okay, just about. Is the line clear? Are you hearing me clearly?
I hear you clearly.
Okay, Alhamdulillah for that. Okay, so this obviously is breaking news regarding the fact, well, it's happened already, but at the time it was breaking news. And that is that after more than a decade of isolation, Assad, the president of war-torn Syria, has been welcomed back into the Arab League. And during his speech, apparently, he said the summit was a historic opportunity to address crises across the region as hundreds in the meantime protested in rebel held northern Syria against his participation in the event. So what exactly is the significance of him being invited back into the Arab League?
Actually turns around and says that the 12 years of war, the decades of oppression and persecution of the Syrian people, the 14 million displaced people and refugees, those who were tortured, those who were killed and arbitrarily detained by the Assad regime, don't have any justice at all. And he goes back to being the leader recognized in the Arab world without any accountability.
What do you make of the fact that the Arab League has actually welcomed him back? Because he's saying things like, during his speech, things like, for example, and I quote, "I hope that this marks the beginning of a new phase of Arab action for solidarity amongst us, for peace in our region, development and prosperity instead of war and destruction."
He's certainly speaking to an audience that understands what it is to be in a position of dictatorial leadership. So he's
Ah,
among his peers in this. And what it does mean to me when I read this is that it's indicating an end of the uprisings that we saw over the Arab Spring and looking at a new era of autocratic rule. But he was very particular in indicating that there needs to be a consolidation of culture and defining the Arab identity, honing in on ethno-religious issues, but particularly being critical of Zionist entity crimes, so trying to draw in unity in the Arab world against the Zionist entity, and then very critical of what he termed Ottoman expansion and support of Ikhwan Muslimin or the Muslim Brotherhood. He's asked for a review of the Charter of the Arab League rules and procedures, and I think that speaks to the reasoning why he was ousted from the Arab League in the first place. And what was very interesting for me was that he spoke as a doctor. And he talked about treating the ailments in the region. He talked about treating the diseases, not treating the symptoms. And that was very poignant for me because the very spark of the Syrian revolution 12 years ago was graffiti that was scribbled on a wall in Daraa saying, "Doctor, you are next," meaning that you're next to fall. And yet he has survived only by the support of external forces, including Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia.
Okay, you spoke about his comment regarding the issue around the danger of the expansionist Ottoman thought. That was a direct swipe at Turkish President Erdogan, which obviously indicates that there's no love lost between those two countries, and the fact that Turkey is sitting with a lot of displaced Syrian people in their country on the border, the border towns between Turkey and Syria. You also spoke about the displaced Syrian people that are now all around the world. What does this action then signal to Turkey and the displaced people all around the world? Also bearing in mind that lots of Syrians have protested against him rejoining the Arab League and have protested against his brutality in his country and against his own people.
The Syrian people lost their lives in order to try and have change in their country. They were being persecuted long before Bashar al Assad under his father, and that kind of autonomy and autocratic rule fed into Bashar al Assad's reign. These refugees, it was the worst refugee crisis that the world had ever seen. I mean, people were really fleeing for their lives, not just from war, but from the persecution of this leader. So to indicate now to these refugees that it's time to go home, it's time to, of course, everyone wants to go back to their homes, but under what conditions? And going home at the high risk of being detained, at the high risk of being tortured, at the high risk of being disappeared. And this has happened to a number of Syrians in the last 3 to 4 years who have been lured back into Damascus under the pretext that things are better now. Come back and all is forgiven and we're going to be building a new country. And then they've been disappeared and tortured and never heard of again. Again, it speaks to the lack of accountability, the lack of justice, the absence of an international program that actually says to these Syrian refugees that your voices have been heard and things will be different. It won't be. But what it also speaks to, and that particular statement that he made on the Ottoman expansion, it's the Turkish elections have been quite contentious in this past month. They're going to a second round for the presidential elections. And one of the issues that has been high on the agenda has been the hosting of the Syrian refugees. There are 3 million of them in Turkey, but because the economy has been under so much of pressure, rising xenophobia against Syrians has really come to the crux in the last year. And Erdogan has been under increasing pressure to repatriate many of these Syrian refugees. And it's become a contentious issue within his presidential campaign.
Okay, so someone has also made a comment saying that Arab nations are rehabilitating the Assad regime. Would you agree with that? And what do they exactly mean by the rehabilitation of Assad and Syria? And obviously, this is the beginning of the acceptance of Syria by the broader Arab nation or nations. How do you see all of this playing out? Because clearly, those Syrian refugees all around the world are not going to return till they see either the fall of Assad or some other form of meaningful change in Syria before they come back to rebuild their country.
I don't think that we're looking at a rehabilitation of an individual, because how does that happen when he's amongst his peers? When these other tyrannical rulers are the ones who are allegedly rehabilitating him. I think that what we're looking at is a broader strategy that is coming across, and noting very particularly that Saudi Arabia has been at the helm of this, of inviting him back into the Arab League. We need to understand Saudi's role in this recalibration of the Middle East and how critical that is. There's a significant shift of power that's taking place. And while during the Arab Spring and beyond that, we were looking at an anti-Iran bloc, that's changing. With China having brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this is the offset of that, because what happened is that Saudi Arabia and Iran have come to an agreement that having the spillover effect of trying to resolve the situation and the war in Yemen, having to resolve the situation in Syria, and then moving forward with a more unified perspective. I think that this certainly does put Israel on the back foot, because they have been pandering to the idea that there should always be an Iran bloc, anti-Iran bloc, and that the Arab world should be doing something about the big threat of Iran. And this has changed. So it would be interesting to see how that power dynamic is played. And certainly that came across again in Assad's speech. It was a very powerful speech. I mean, I can't deny that some of the terms that he used and some of the statements that he made really would make people sit up and listen. The question that you posed then, Julie, is what happens to these refugees? What happens to the people that have left Syria because they were unable to continue under his rule? And we noticed since 2018, when things started to gradually normalize with Bashar al-Assad, some of the European countries who were hosting the Syrian refugees were already trying to encourage them to return. And in fact, some of them were trying to force repatriate them, saying that things are better, go and live in your own country, sort out whatever needs to happen in your country. You are citizens of that country. It doesn't right now. And I think that what we're going to see is a strong civil society movement from those Syrian refugees trying to highlight that these atrocities have not come to an end. But it's going to be incredibly difficult because now they don't have the support of any of the Arab countries. But I certainly think that they do have the support of the people on the ground.
Okay, two more questions, Zeenat, but we need to go for an ad break. Let's go for that break, and I'll come back with some comments from a listener and then one or two questions from my side. So please do stand by.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
No one wants to let go of that feeling of closeness to Allah that we feel by the end of Ramadan. Ramadan is over, but that closeness doesn't have to be. The deeds most loved by Allah are those done regularly, even if they are small. So don't let go of that feeling. Give a small amount regularly and hold on to Allah's love. Donate now to Islamic Relief.
There's no smell that takes me back to the comfort of my childhood than the smell of black seed oil being applied by my nani. Now I'm using Tib black seed in my own home to soothe sniffles and coughs, to help with digestion and immunity, and of course, as part of my beauty routine. After all these years, I've come to appreciate the wisdom in finding comfort and shifa in trusted treatments like Tib black seed. You can find Tib black seed at all leading pharmacies or find out more at blackseed.co.za.
Conveniently located along the banks of the Crocodile River bordering the Kruger National Park, as a guest at Buckler's Africa Lodge, one can enjoy an amazing sunrise or sunset on our spacious deck area while you catch a glimpse of some wildlife sightings along the Crocodile River. The sounds of the African savannah will greet you whilst you enjoy your morning coffee. Buckler's Africa Lodge by Tingana Collection. Buckler's Africa Lodge is ideally situated only 6 kilometers from the Crocodile Bridge Gate in the Kruger National Park. Catering for all travelers with variety, we have 4 types of the finest rooms: superior rooms, deluxe suites, and 2-bedroomed family units. Each room is equipped with the finest amenities to make your stay unforgettable. Guests can choose between the self-catering option or book their accommodation with breakfast and dinner included. Buckler's Africa Lodge is your ideal location for the ultimate Kruger getaway experience. We specialize in exhilarating and educational game drives in Kruger, tailor-made to suit your family. Inquire about our various accommodation offerings and other activities. Visit www.tingana.co.za for more information. Buckler's Africa Lodge by Tingana Collection. Experience the pulse of Africa with us.
Ah, the kitchen, the heart of the home, where memories are made and celebrated. Our go-to place for those freshly stacked pancakes early in the morning or for that late-night snack munchies. We are in there together, cooking, eating, and celebrating life together. Let's keep the kitchen a place that is shared by everyone, where we build stronger bonds and grow together. Sunfoil, Now We Cooking. Visit nowwecooking.co.za for recipes that everyone can help make.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Al Bayt Lodge, your true home away from home. Al Bayt is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities, conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities. Your stay will be truly unforgettable, as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Al Bayt has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albaytlodge.co.za.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. 8:23 a.m. This is News and Views on Salam Media, and we're talking with Zeenat Adam from the Afro-Middle East Centre. We're looking at the issue around the Syrian president having attended the Arab League summit. What exactly does this signify? Zeenat, welcome back. Let me give you the first question from Nazima Taladia, and she's saying that the USA and Israel is the reason for the war and so-called civil war in Syria. They demonize Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein like they do all other leaders, like, for example, Putin as well. Your thoughts?
I think that's an oversimplistic way of viewing the world, and I think that it's much more complicated than how your listener has laid it out. I think that we need to listen firstly to what the average Syrian believes and what their experiences are before we reach out and talk about what international influences there have been. And yes, international players took advantage of the situation in Syria, but it's at the heart of what was happening in Syria was the frustration of the people with the kind of leadership that they have and the brutal leadership. So I think we need to draw a distinction between what that international interference was and what was happening to the average Syrian on the ground. 14 million people don't leave their homes just because the United States and Israel were interfering in the situation. The United States took advantage of the situation. They entered into Syrian territory and they still remain there, siphoning off oil in the northeastern regions. They have taken advantage of that. They have played a role in terms of sanctions before the war took place, that they had bilateral sanctions against Syria for a number of years. But the Americans also played a very strong role in training the Syrian officials in torture and in the holding of black sites during the time that they were renditioning people from Afghanistan and other parts of the world. So let's not think that Assad was not in the hands of the Americans at some stage. Those gulags that he was using for torture originated as black sites for the Americans. I think we also need to recognize that the external interference of, Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia is significant. It was a turning point the moment that Russia entered the war with their aerial power. Up until then, Bashar al-Assad was losing against his own people, and things looked to be in the hands of the Free Syrians and the Free Syrian Army. But it's also indicative of, and I've mentioned earlier, that Israel has taken advantage of the weakness of Syria during this time, and they have been attacking and bombarding certain sites within Syria on the pretext that this has been outposts of Iran. So it's much more complex than your listener has laid it out to be. And I think that if we look at the shift that has taken place, it began from around 2018. The UAE started to say, let's end the boycott against Assad. We're not really getting anywhere and we need to start opening dialogue. Very few of the Arab states members were interested at that time. But during the last few months, since the earthquake happened and humanitarian aid corridors were opened for Syria, a discussion for diplomatic corridors to be opened also came to the table. And Egypt played a very strong role, Saudi Arabia. The only country that has been opposed to this normalization with Syria is Qatar, and the Qatari Emir left the Arab League meeting ahead of Bashar al-Assad's speech. And this is because Qatar has a foreign policy that says that there were discussions and agreements that were made in terms of the UN process, and that Qatar doesn't want to be part of the betrayal of the Syrian people who relied on them very strongly for change in their country.
Okay, Nazima has really given us a whole host of comments, further comments. We may not be able to cover all of that, but let me read out one or two of the more important ones. Let me give them to you. Let me read out three, and then you can respond to those. She goes on to say that the greater plan for Israel is to take land, and Syria to take land, let's see if I'm reading this correctly, is to take land, and Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, etc., is all part of conquering the Middle East. That's comment number one. Number two, our people are sadly misled exactly how they are fed preferred political views about Afghanistan and the Taliban. The USA bombed Syria and steals its oil. Libya is a case in point. And then, all right, the last one is really about Salam Media. She says, congrats to Salam Media for the excellent work you're doing. Definitely more advanced than other media, but it's thanks, Nazima, to input from our listeners like yourself and the amazing guests like Zeenat Adam, who come in and obviously analyze these deeply complex political issues all around the world, particularly in the Middle East, that enables us to put out the type of information that we don't get from other platforms. So Zeenat, thank you to you. Nazima, thank you to you for becoming a part of the conversation. Zeenat, would you like to respond, please?
I think you should invite Nazima to the studio and have a conversation with her. She has some very strong views that need to be heard. I think that I've covered those issues that she raises in the follow-up questions.
Okay. My final comments then is, would you say it's the end of an era and the beginning of a new one? I guess while many Arab countries in the past sided with the Syrian opposition, they provided significant military and political assistance to the opposition. Would we now say it's the reverse now? And what changes are we going to be seeing? Is this boding well for the Syrian people, or is it a wait and see situation? Because we're not quite sure what's on Assad's mind and how his neighbors are going to assist him probably rebuild Syria.
I think that it certainly will have a significant change in terms of the economic development and rebuilding and infrastructure rebuilding in Syria. That's already started to happen on a smaller scale, but it would open up a little bit more. And certainly Bashar al-Assad would be using this as leverage to be able to invite economic investment. But we need to recognize that economic investment doesn't necessarily change the policies on the ground and the safety of Syrian people. So we need to certainly apply pressure on Syria for that. I think that one of the reasons that I thought it would come up in the questions, but it hasn't, is that in this time of the sanctions that have been applied against Syria and during this war, it's really taken its toll on the Syrian economy. So it's been alleged that as a result of that, Bashar al-Assad has opened up his country for the production and the trafficking of Captagon, which is a narcotic that has actually entered into the Arab world. And that many of these states are trying to curb that trafficking of this narcotic. And one of the reasons, I wouldn't say it's the particular leading reason, but one of the reasons for inviting and for repairing the diplomatic relations and having rapprochement with Assad was for this. But I think on your broader question, Julie, as I indicated earlier, to me this is about an entire political dynamical shift in the Middle East power. And I think that it is very strongly centered in Saudi Arabia. And I think that we're going to see some major developments in terms of how alliances are going to be changing for the good and for the bad. We need to be very watchful of what happens in the Middle East over the next few months and over the next few years. Things are moving very, very rapidly.
And just to touch on the issue around the Captagon that is now flooding the Middle East, we can't sit, well, the rest of the world, obviously, it does mean that we're going to get that narcotic flooding the markets all over the world. And I know that Saudi Arabia is particularly concerned about that situation. So thank you for pointing that out, Zeenat. We have actually run out of time. I think I need to have you and Nazima together on a show because let me just end off by sharing one or two more comments that she's made. I'm not sure if we have time for it, but she goes on to say, let's see, there are so many. She does say that Assad won an open election recently. Comment number 2, yes, thanks to Zeenat, but I disagree with her analysis. And number 3, no comment about ISIS, that the USA and Israel created and armed. They created horror for the Syrians. Can we please leave that for another conversation? I'm going to try and save these questions, Zeenat, and maybe get the two of you together on this show. Would you like to join us?
Let me be very brief on that, Julie, because I've been on air now for about half an hour. I was only supposed to be on for 7 minutes, but I think it's fair that I have an opportunity to respond to that. The first thing is that we don't have the opportunity to talk about every single issue related to Syria while on air. We've given 7 to 10 minutes, and so the focus was on what was happening in the Arab League. When we talk about ISIS is the creation of the Americans emanating out of their invasion of Iraq. Yes, I would probably agree with Nazima on that. Whether or not ISIS has actually been a horror against the Syrian people, to a certain degree, yes. But when we look at the statistics, 90% of the horror that was perpetrated against the Syrian people, and this is by actually documented statistics, was by Bashar al-Assad, not by ISIS. ISIS was about 3%. So we need to be very clear about how those things happened and how that's manipulated in the media. If we're talking about the elections that Bashar al-Assad has had over the years, every dictator wins elections by 93 to 99%. And if you don't have the voices of those refugee people who had to flee and they aren't able to participate in elections, then that is not a clear, free and fair elections. And we cannot talk about democracy in an autocratic state. Then automatically we're going to be talking about issues in other parts of the world as well, where autocracy leads. And yes, people go to the polls, but in fear and with manipulated elections. So I think Nazima certainly needs to be on your show. I don't have much more time because I actually afforded much more time than I was supposed to for this interview.
And we really and truly appreciate it. That's where we leave it. Zeenat Adam, what a pleasure to have had you on the show yet once again. After a very, very long time, you go well. And thank you once again for your time on the show this morning. Okay, I think Zeenat's gone already. It is 8:35 a.m. That was Zeenat Adam from the Afro-Middle East Centre. And let me just round off by one or two more comments from Nazima Taladia. She's saying not accurate to the comments, some of the comments that Zeenat has made. And she also says that Assad, he is the leader. He was obliged to protect his country and his citizens. Okay, let's leave it there. It would be wonderful to have both Nazima and Zeenat together on the same platform, and let's get these views and counter arguments, I guess. Thank you for listening to this part of the show. And Nazima, thank you indeed for your deep insights on the matter as well. It is exactly 8:36 News and Views right here on Salam Media. Still to come, we're going to be talking to Asri, Jonathan Yahya West, and we are going to be talking about tender contracts being awarded in the City of Gold.
One word.